No Wall They Can Build. A Guide to Borders and Migration Across North America. Episode 4. The South, Part 2. Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras. Guatemala. As I said, I've met more Mexican citizens crossing the border to return to their old life in the United States than to start a new life there. With Guatemalan citizens, it's the other way around. Why? Guatemala has been governed by a feudal system ever since colonization. To this day, the country is dominated by a small group of light-skinned families known as the Seven Families, the oligarchy, or the deep state, who have managed power since their European descendants arrived in the Americas. They have lorded it over the indigenous majority for more than 500 years. These families control the military and the vast majority of land and wealth, dividing major monopolies between them. The old elite is linked to coffee, sugar, and banana exports, cattle ranching, mining, and some heavy industry, such as cement production. A newer elite is linked to drug smuggling and human trafficking. Guatemalan political parties align with these competing interests. Partido Patriota was in office for much of the 2010s and is now in disgrace. It was aligned with the military and various factions of the deep state. It favored orange, and its symbol was a clenched fist. As of 2016, these same people are back again, although they now prefer blue, and their new party is called Frente de Convergencia Nacional. Like a scary clown, the Guatemalan oligarchs have a mask for every occasion. It's no secret who the real power is behind the throne. On the other hand, I've heard any number of Guatemalans bluntly describe LIDER, Libertad Democracia Renovada, the Renewed Democratic Liberty Party, as the narco party. It's always in the running, and it favors red. 100 years ago, there was a revolution in Mexico. It ended the feudal system and laid the groundwork for the foundation of a modern state, for better or for worse. This never happened in Guatemala. The country is not governed by people who have the well-being of Guatemalan citizens at heart. In contrast to their counterparts in Mexico, the oligarchs do not uphold their end of a social contract, and they make no real pretensions to do so. Yet, like Mexico, Guatemala is not a failed state. The government has a job to do, and it has done it well for centuries. It supplies the United States with sugar, bananas, and coffee, and it prevents indigenous people from placing the seven families on boats and sending them back to Spain. The government has carried out this duty in the only way possible, with machine guns, helicopters, and flamethrowers. So, instead of a revolution, Guatemala endured an almost unfathomably brutal 36-year civil war. The CIA set the wheels in motion in 1954 when they sponsored a coup that overthrew then-President Jacobo Arbenz in retribution for his attempts to redistribute land. The immensely powerful American-owned United Fruit Company, today known as Chiquita, opposed land reform, and the CIA acted on their behalf. Denied any other route to social change, an assortment of indigenous, campesino, student, union, and leftist groups commenced armed struggle against the state in 1960. The conflict was fueled for decades by the financial and military support that the American government provided to a succession of Guatemalan military regimes. These regimes perpetrated a catalog of massacres, disappearance, torture, and other acts of state terror against the civil society of Guatemala, culminating in the scorched earth policy of genocide against the Mayan indigenous population during the rule of Efraín Ríos Montt in the early 1980s. Approximately 200,000 civilians lost their lives during the war. Indigenous people suffered disproportionately. Armed conflict ended in December 1996 with the signing of the peace accords between the umbrella organization of guerrilla groups, the Guatemalan National Revolutionary Unity, or URNG, and the Guatemalan state. Hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans fled to Mexico and the United States during the 1980s. Most had to do so illegally, since the Reagan administration, which was arming and funding the primary perpetrators of the violence, refused to recognize those exiled as refugees under American law. Many of these refugees and their families established lives in the United States and have been there ever since. Participants in the American Sanctuary Movement assisted thousands of Guatemalans on their journey north during this time. 20 years later, some of the same people went on to form No More Deaths. 20 years later, peace may be worse than war. I've actually heard Guatemalans say this. As of 2016, Guatemala has the highest rate of chronic malnutrition in the Western Hemisphere, the fourth highest in the entire world. Chronic malnutrition affects 47% of all children, 55% of all people in rural areas, 69% of indigenous people, and 70% of indigenous children. In some villages, that number rises to 90%. This is significantly higher than in Honduras and Nicaragua, both of which are significantly poorer than Guatemala. Haiti is the poorest country in the Western Hemisphere, and the average Guatemalan earns 4 times more than the average Haitian, but Guatemala's childhood malnutrition rates are twice as high as Haiti's. The inequality in Guatemala is positively diabolical. Food insecurity has been found to be the single biggest factor driving migration from the country, according to a recent report published by the International Organization of Migration and the United Nations World Food Program. Based on what I have seen firsthand and heard from Guatemalans, I concur. We are talking about a country with extensive economic, political, cultural, and military ties to the United States, which is blessed with fertile soil, plentiful water, a favorable climate, and abundant natural resources, whose markets are overflowing with fruits and vegetables, and which exports well over $1 billion of food to the north every year. Peace in Guatemala is the peace of a graveyard, plundered by thieves and haunted by the ghosts of hungry children. About 60% of Guatemalans identify as indigenous. 26 different languages are spoken in the country. There are many places where Spanish is not the dominant language, and there is a great deal of cultural diversity between the different indigenous groups. Indigenous people make up a more prominent part of Guatemalan society than almost anywhere else in North America. In Mexico, for instance, a substantial part of the population is indigenous as well, but nowhere near as much as in Guatemala, except in some parts of Oaxaca and Chiapas. Racism is extremely pronounced in every aspect of Guatemalan society. The derogatory terms used by criollos, those of mostly European ancestry, and Ladinos, those of mixed European and indigenous ancestry, to refer to Indigenous, those of mostly indigenous ancestry, and particularly those who do not speak Spanish as a first language, carry as much historical weight as do the terms that are used by white people to refer to black people in the United States. This is true in Mexico as well, but it is even more pronounced in Guatemala. Most of the worst atrocities of the war were ordered by criollos, who commanded the army, carried out by Ladinos, who make up the bulk of the army, and inflicted on Indigenous, who make up the bulk of the guerrilla as well as the civilian population. The Peace Accords of 1996 mark a complicated watershed in Guatemalan history. For nearly 40 years, the guerrillas, most of whom were indigenous Mayans, stood up to a truly ruthless and unprincipled foe, backed by the full weight of the American government. The guerrillas did not exactly win, but neither did they entirely lose. And when they finally did lay down their arms, it was not without extracting some meaningful concessions from the Guatemalan state. One of the more important of these concessions was Convention 169 of the Peace Accords, which writes communal land stewardship into Guatemalan law. Legally speaking, a lot of Guatemalan land is not owned privately by individuals or corporations, nor publicly by the state, but communally by the indigenous people who occupy it. Furthermore, under Convention 169, resource extraction issues on communal land have to be decided by communal processes. This means that if a mining company wants to mine for gold on communal land, it cannot simply buy the land, nor can the state just lease it out. A popular assembly of the community involved has to approve the project, and this permission often turns out to be difficult to obtain. This aspect of Guatemalan environmental and indigenous law can provide stronger protection against extractive industries than either Mexican or American law usually does. Imagine if the U.S. Forest Service had to go through a community assembly every time it wanted to lease out public land to a logging company. It took 36 years of armed struggle to win this concession. Unsurprisingly, however, these parts of the peace accord have been consistently abrogated by a long succession of venal and corrupt post-war governments who have tried their best to auction off the country to the highest bidder. Nonetheless, Indigenous people have power in Guatemala in a way that is very different from what one sees in the United States or even most of Mexico. On the day of the World Cup final in 2014, the Guatemalan Congress tried to slip through a piece of legislation called the Monsanto Law, which would have given exclusivity on patented seeds to a handful of transnational companies. Indigenous groups blockaded Congress, refusing to let in food or water or to let anyone out to sleep or use the bathroom until the law was repealed, which it was. It is very difficult to imagine this happening in Washington, D.C., or Mexico City. Resource extraction is a major issue in Guatemala. In the western highland provinces of San Marcos and Huehuetenango, in particular, along the border with the Mexican state of Chiapas, there is a great deal of active mining, primarily gold, silver, and copper, as well as many more locations where transnational corporations are attempting to push licenses for new mining projects through the popular assemblies. Guatemala has an extensive history of resistance to resource exploitation, especially in those regions. Both state and private police, as well as military and paramilitary forces, have jailed and murdered many opponents of mining and other megaprojects there. Not coincidentally, many of the Guatemalans I have met crossing the border turned out to be coming from these parts of the country, San Marcos and Huehuetenango. I've seen evidence firsthand to suggest that mining companies, the drug cartels, and the Guatemalan state have been colluding to cleanse parts of these areas of inhabitants in order to clear the way for megaprojects, drug smuggling, and human trafficking. I'll return to this later. The vast majority of the cocaine from South America also passes through the Mexican-Guatemalan border on the way to the United States, along with all undocumented Central American migrants and refugees. As in Mexico, both state and non-state actors compete for control of the drug smuggling and human trafficking industries built up around the border. This plays out no less violently in Guatemala. Add on top of that the truly frightening levels of murder and violent crime in some parts of the country, much of it an extension of El Salvador's gang problems. And, long story short, the place is a mess. I've met numerous Guatemalans who have told me that the oligarchy has fomented general social violence in order to justify the use of a strong hand to quell the chaos, the hand of the Guatemalan military, which was deeply discredited after the war. On top of all this, at least speaking from my personal experience, Guatemala is profoundly dysfunctional, in a way that Mexico is not. Teachers don't get paid, nurses don't get paid, hospitals don't have sufficient medicine or equipment, the justice system is a shambles, the government is corrupt on every level and everybody knows it, there's virtually no legal work in much of the country, there are loose dogs cannibalizing each other in trash heaps, and in general the state does even less for people than it does in Mexico. The government won't put out fires if they are burning in places where indigenous people live. My friends and I spent almost 2 weeks in January 2015 putting out a forest fire that was burning above their village and threatening the town water supply. We did this with machetes and shovels, with no protective equipment whatsoever, and with burning boulders rolling down the mountain above us. The Guatemalan government refused to send a helicopter from the capital to douse the flames. The forest had not burned in living memory, I was told. Everybody said that it was a consequence of climate change. Droughts connected to climate change are contributing to deforestation, disrupting crop cycles, and exacerbating food insecurity in Guatemala. None of the issues that led to the internal armed conflict in Guatemala have been resolved. All of the components of a future war are there, waiting to explode. An entire generation of armed struggle is no walk in the park, and the fatigue is still palpable 20 years later. This is one noticeable difference between Guatemalan and Mexican society. I've often heard Mexicans, even those who do not ascribe to radical politics, say things like, "The situation in my country is untenable. Maybe we need another revolution." I've often heard Guatemalans, even those who do ascribe to radical politics, say things like, "I just hope we can address the problems in my country without having to go to war again." I fear for what the future holds for my friends there. That being said, the biggest thing to happen in Guatemala in recent years was probably the widespread protests that brought down the government of the most recent ex-president, Otto Pérez Molina, in September 2015. Pérez Molina was a former army general who personally coordinated massacres in the indigenous area of the Ixil Triangle during the Rios Montt years. He was elected in 2011 on a remarkably unsubtle platform. A strong hand was both his campaign slogan and the symbol of his political party, the Partido Patriota. As it turns out, he and most of his administration spent much of their time in office overseeing a corruption scheme that came to be known as La Linea, in which the Guatemalan Customs Agency offered importers greatly reduced tariffs in exchange for kickbacks that were shared among dozens of government officials. When the story went public, massive protests broke out across the country, eventually gaining so much momentum that Pérez Molina, his son-in-law, the then Vice President Roxana Baldetti, and dozens of other high-ranking officials all ended up not only unemployed, but in jail. Although it is more than a little perverse that Pérez Molina was finally brought to account for graft rather than for personally coordinating acts of genocide, it was still unprecedented in Guatemala, where it is unheard of for a sitting president and ex-general to be brought down by street protests, much less without massive bloodshed. While this was heartening, most Guatemalans I know believe that part of what happened was that the military and the oligarchy came to see Pérez Molina as an embarrassment, abandoned him, and began to prepare the figure of his successor, Jimmy Morales, the current president and literally an ex-clown. It's not clear what is going to happen next. In short, this is why so many people are leaving their old lives in Guatemala, to get away from widespread conditions of poverty and instability.
The Guatemalan guerrilla movement had a largely unrecognized influence on world affairs by directly inspiring the aesthetic of the Zapatista rebellion and by profoundly informing and prefiguring the rebellion itself. Chiapas directly borders Guatemala. It is also heavily Mayan. From the ski masks and the pseudonyms to the illuminating realization that the seizure of state power is not actually a revolutionary project, many aspects of the Zapatista movement can be seen as extensions of, reactions to, or lessons learned from the Guatemalan Civil War. The Zapatistas deserve tremendous credit for applying these lessons correctly, but it's worth remembering that the image that they made irresistible was something that the Guatemalan guerrillas actually did for nearly 40 years. The guerrilla and all of the suffering and sacrifices that its participants endured have been largely forgotten outside of Guatemala. But through the Zapatistas, its influence can still be seen across the world today.
El Salvador. El Salvador is smaller than Guatemala, more densely populated, and less indigenous. In marked contrast to Guatemala or even Mexico, the population is nearly entirely Ladino. In El Salvador, once again, there was a brutal civil war from 1979 to 1990 that claimed around 80,000 lives. Once again, the American government backed a succession of military regimes that committed a series of massacres, disappearances, rapes, bombings, torture, collective reprisals, and other atrocities on the public at large. The most infamous single incident was probably the murder of over 800 civilians in the village of El Mozote by the Salvadoran army on December 11, 1981. In El Salvador, even more so than in Guatemala, it is probable that the coalition of guerrilla groups, the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front, or FMLN, would have succeeded in overthrowing the Salvadoran government, were it not for the intervention of the American state. As much as a quarter of the entire country fled the war during the 1980s, mostly to the United States, again often with the assistance of the sanctuary movement. The war formally ended with the signing of the peace agreement in 1992. About 2 million Salvadorans now live in the United States, roughly a fifth of the entire population. In my observation, El Salvador is noticeably more well-off than either Guatemala or Honduras, if less so than Mexico. $3 to $5 billion in remittances pour into the very small country yearly from Salvadoran workers in the United States, perhaps a fifth of the total GDP. One can find separate bins for trash, compost, and recycling in many municipal parks. There are fewer stray dogs, and generally speaking, it looks like a grittier version of the United States, rather than a different world entirely. Also, in 2009, the FMLN was elected to power for the first time since the end of the war, and for a while behaved themselves somewhat better than the right-wing governments in Guatemala and Honduras. So it could be tempting to view El Salvador as a regional success story. However, this is where the story gets complicated. Various Salvadoran street gangs formed in refugee communities in Los Angeles during and after the war. At first, based, at least in part, on a legitimate need to carve out some place for Salvadorans in the not very welcoming atmosphere of riot-era LA. The most prominent of these gangs became Mara Salvatrucha, MS-13, and Barrio 18, or M18. Thousands of members of both groups were eventually deported back to El Salvador, where they began to fight each other for territory. It is incorrect to understand MS-13 and M18 as monolithic organizations. Rather, they are franchised and dispersed networks consisting of numerous cliques and factions. That being said, the gangs exert tremendous influence over daily life in much of El Salvador. In many places, they possess power comparable to that of the state. Gang members are the sole or primary breadwinners in many poor and working-class Salvadoran households. And in many neighborhoods, the gangs function as the sole employer and de facto police. There are numerous downsides to this system, the most serious being that the three-sided conflict between MS-13, M18, and the government has made El Salvador one of the most violent places on the planet outside of an active war zone. In March 2012, a truce was agreed between the three parties, negotiated by former FMLN rebel and Congressman Raul Miango, the Minister of Public Security and Justice, David Munguia Paez, and Monsignor Fabio Colindres, a bishop of the Catholic Church. Although it is not clear exactly how this transpired, it appears that the government agreed to a variety of concessions, including the repeal of the Gang Prohibition Act, the return of the army to the barracks, the end of police operations in territory controlled by the gangs, the repeal of a law which provided benefits in exchange for information about people with criminal ties, and a series of improvements in prisoners' quality of life. In exchange for this, it appears that the mostly imprisoned leadership of MS-13 and M18 agreed to a cessation of hostilities between themselves and with the state. Practically overnight, homicides dropped from 14 a day to 5. The truce held, at least in part, for nearly 3 years, and by most accounts I've heard, the country was pretty livable for a while. We saw results on the border immediately, where we met far fewer Salvadorans crossing the desert during that time. However, the truce had completely broken down by 2015, for complicated reasons involving intransigence and duplicity on all sides, including that of the U.S. government, which was never remotely excited about the arrangement, presumably being of the opinion that a stable and prosperous El Salvador governed by the FMLN and aligned with Venezuela and the South American Pink Tide was not actually a desirable outcome. Violence spiraled out of control in 2015, reaching levels not seen since the worst of the Civil War, or almost anywhere in the world outside of Syria, Iraq, and the Central African Republic. Under serious domestic pressure to restore some semblance of order, the FMLN resorted to tactics borrowed from its enemies during the war: night raids, mass imprisonment, and collective punishment. When this happened, the gangs did not take it lying down, responding with a vigorous and concerted campaign of assassinations of police and soldiers, as well as car bombings targeting police stations and other government installations, a tactic rarely, if ever, seen in the most unstable parts of Mexico. The Salvadoran government and press, in turn, have begun to use the language of terrorism and existential warfare against enemy combatants when speaking about the conflict. This is ironic, considering that the government is in no small part comprised of people who were once labeled terrorists and criminals, as many gang members in some of the more reflective parts of the FMLN itself have repeatedly pointed out. A web search combining mareros, or pandilleros, with cucarachas turns up endless and blood-curdling commentary from presumably middle and upper-class Salvadorans describing gang members as cockroaches and intimating that the only solution is kill them all. This is all the more frightening because it has happened before in El Salvador. Various Salvadorans have told me that it is not impossible that some of the bombings may be false flag actions designed by such elements to justify social cleansing. One shudders to think what may happen when the right gets back into power. Unsurprisingly, in 2015, we saw a surge in the numbers of Salvadorans crossing the desert, nearly all reporting similar conditions back home, and expressing some version of a similar desire to get away from the mayhem consuming their country. At the risk of being repetitive, it's worth driving home how much responsibility the government of the United States bears in creating this mess. First, it bankrolled the Salvadoran right wing in its war on the better half of its own society. Then, it deported thousands of the survivors of this war, dead broke, back to a country the size of Massachusetts that it had just destroyed. Most recently, it undermined the efforts of the FMLN and the gangs to come to a workable compromise. After all this, it was very unlikely that anything could have happened except for El Salvador to go up in flames.
The following story is well known in El Salvador, if not in much of the rest of the world. The man who ordered the massacre at El Mozote was an especially revolting character by the name of Lieutenant Domingo Monterrosa Barrios, commander at the time of the Atacatl Battalion, an elite counterinsurgency unit of the Salvadoran army. This battalion, which carried out the massacre, was created in 1980 at the United States Army School of the Americas in Panama and trained in Fort Bragg, North Carolina by U.S. Special Forces. Monterrosa graduated from the School of the Americas, like most of his ilk across the region. According to Mark Danner's account of the incident, in the massacre at El Mozote, Monterrosa was known to be unusually obsessed with destroying Radio Venceremos, the FMLN radio station that specialized in news of the war, acerbic commentary, and pointed ridicule of the government. Radio Venceremos had mocked and denounced him personally on endless occasions. The radio station had become a potent symbol operating for years inside territory that Monterrosa claimed to control. Monterrosa's career was ended in October 1984 by an elaborate ruse. A small FMLN unit carried by a radio transmitter to an area patrolled by army troops was then, quote-unquote, discovered by the soldiers, exchanged fire, quote-unquote, suffered casualties, and was then, quote-unquote, forced to, quote-unquote, evacuate the position and, quote-unquote, abandon the transmitter. Radio Venceremos went off the air immediately, and the following day, Monterrosa convened national and international press in the city of San Miguel, announcing triumphantly that the radio station was no more. Monterrosa went to the northeastern town of Huateca, loaded the trophy into his personal helicopter by hand, and took off for the press conference, accompanied by 5 other commanders of the Atacatl Battalion. Apparently, the chief American military advisor on scene turned down the ride. The transmitter contained 8 sticks of dynamite and a detonator activated by air pressure. The helicopter and everyone inside of it was blown out of the sky as it passed over guerrilla positions near El Mozote, where presumably the molecules of Monterrosa's body mingled with those of the 800 people whose deaths he had ordered. The remnants of the helicopter are still on display at the Museum of the Revolution in the municipality of Perkin, not far from where the massacre took place. I can attest that haggard ex-combatants there still tell this tale with great relish.
Honduras. I have spent much less time in Honduras than Mexico, Guatemala, or El Salvador. At the risk of lapsing into extreme informality, I will say this. When standing on the Salvadoran or Nicaraguan side of the border, holding a piece of refuse, one can normally say, where should I put this empty water bottle? Perhaps in a trash can. On the Honduran side, it's more like, well, I guess I'll just throw it on the ground, which is what absolutely everyone else does because there's literally no other option. And look at that army guy with a huge assault rifle, and that other one, and those other ones. Of course, I would prefer to see the garbage collected by decentralized networks of friends than by the state, but it does seem to be the worst of both worlds when the state clearly exists, has the capacity to place huge numbers of American-made M16s in the hands of God knows who, but also demonstrates no interest whatsoever in providing the most basic health, sanitation, education, social welfare, or waste management services to the population. That, in a nutshell, is modern Honduras. Combining the poverty of Nicaragua, the dysfunction of Guatemala, and the violence of El Salvador, but lacking the recent legacy of at least partially successful efforts to address the country's problems through armed struggle that characterizes all 3 of those places, Honduras is a case study in everything bad in this part of the world. There was a 1950s-style coup in Honduras in 2009, backed by the government of the United States, and things appear to have been unremittingly messed up ever since. We have met an enormous number of Hondurans crossing the border in the years since the coup, out of all proportion to the size of the country. In 2012, for example, less than half of the people that I met on the border came from Mexico, Guatemala, or El Salvador, and more than half came from Honduras, despite the fact that Mexico alone has a population 16 times the size of Honduras. We heard different versions of the same story from countless people. Grinding poverty, chronic hunger and malnutrition, widespread violence and insecurity, much of it an extension of El Salvador's gang problems, a rampant HIV/AIDS epidemic, appalling levels of violence against women and LGBTQ people, assassinations of environmentalists, union organizers, and human rights advocates, and a lack of the most basic services or opportunities. Let me emphasize this one more time. If Honduras is in shambles, it is not because Hondurans are any less resourceful or fundamentally decent than anyone else, or even because its rulers are any more wretched and callous than our own. It is because the structure of the North American economy has made any other outcome impossible.
One of my most cherished belongings is a Honduran basketball jersey given to me with pride by a teenager I met in the desert, who eventually made it home to her loving and supportive family in Los Angeles. I hope to see the day when my Honduran friends have the option of a decent life in their place of birth, whether it takes a revolution in Honduras, the United States, or both.
Tensions. Many people in the United States are unaware of how much tension exists between the societies of Mexico and Central America, or of the degree to which Mexicans and Central Americans do not, on the whole, think of themselves as the same people. Perhaps it will be easiest to illustrate this using soccer. During the World Cup, practically any Central American soccer fan will root for any Central American team against any other team in the world. So in 2014, Guatemalans overwhelmingly rooted for Honduras versus France, and millions of Nicaraguans celebrated Costa Rica's string of victories, despite the significant tension between the two societies. However, practically any Central American soccer fan will root against the Mexican team and for any team opposing it. So Guatemalans everywhere cheered when the Netherlands knocked Mexico out of the cup. This tendency seems to trump even memories of war. In my observation, Salvadoran and Guatemalan soccer fans will overwhelmingly and unreservedly root for the United States over Mexico in a head-to-head match. I've watched less soccer in Mexico, but it seems to me that, similarly, most Mexicans will root for anyone over the United States, up to and including Spain. Central Americans, especially migrants and refugees, are on the whole treated horrendously in Mexico, subject to systematic mistreatment by every government body, and unfortunately by some of the public as well. If pressed, many Central Americans, even those who ascribe to radical politics, will express a blanket suspicion of Mexicans in general. That being said, there are countless organizations and individuals in Mexico working in meaningful and concrete solidarity with Central Americans. In my observation, the dynamics are acknowledged and well understood by a great many Mexicans. As is often the case, these barriers can break down under crisis. While working in the desert, I've seen mixed groups of Mexicans and Central Americans save each other's lives, sustain each other through unimaginable hardship, and generally enjoy each other's company. However, I've also seen many examples to the contrary, and the tensions are real. There is also a Byzantine web of ugly stereotypes internal to both Mexico and Central America. To hear it in Mexico, the norteños are rich, stuck-up, trigger-happy gangster cowboys. The chilangos in the capital use entirely too much foul language. This may actually be true. And the sureños are short, brown, and poor. In Guatemala, altiplenses know costeños to be hustlers. And while Salvadorans are respected, it is always considered possible that they may be murderers. Salvadorans often look down on Hondurans, although unfortunately they are not alone in this. Over-the-top Mexican displays of nationalism, similar in many ways to what one sees in the United States, come off as grating and bizarre to Central Americans, half of whom took up arms against their own governments within recent memory. This does not even begin to touch on subcultural dynamics. Americans who think of all Mexicans as straight-laced construction workers may be surprised to find that Mexico City is the freakiest place on the planet. People south of the border are not all the same. You've just listened to episode 4 of No Wall They Can Build, a guide to borders and migration across North America, published by the CrimeThinc Ex-Workers Collective. Stay tuned next week for episode 5, The Trip and The Product. This audiobook is a production of the Ex-Worker Podcast Collective. You can learn more at crimethinc.com/podcast. To order a print copy of the book, read a free PDF version online, check out the poster that accompanies the book, or to learn more about the anarchist struggle for a world without borders, visit crimethinc.com/borders.